My name is Alison St John. I am with the Office of Advanced Molecular Detection at the CDC. So I come to you today, and it's really, I'm just so pleased to see everybody. I've been kind of participating virtually as I had to travel before this. And it's just so wonderful to see this dichotomy of people in the room. I hail 20 years from the Department of Defense, so I come from a very unusual background in bringing that together from a public health perspective in an organization that's usually looking more at missiles and tanks. So it's an interesting perspective to bring as I moved into the CDC realm. So it's great to see some familiar faces, and hopefully we'll get this discussion going, and you guys will really have a lot to say and really kind of wrap this up from a larger perspective. So we've heard a lot of the details, the things that people need, looking at everything from workforce development to the technology and innovation side of things, and really putting that into perspective about classification and how do we have best practices and what are the things that we need as a group entirely. But I want to take that back up a little bit and kind of set the stage for a more global perspective of this. One of the things that I'll talk about is indicators. So we're all looking at early warning, right? A lot of us biosurveillance and early warning, and we're looking at those indicators perhaps through pathogen characteristics. So we're looking at all of the different aspects of what that means and the transmission of the disease and how that happens. There are a lot of different efforts out there globally, and biosurveillance can be defined in many different ways, just as epidemiology and genetic epidemiology and all these different aspects can be defined, right? But one of the things that we learned, not just with COVID, but with other aspects, H5N1, not just currently, but previously, H1N1, Zika, looking at H7N9 coming out of China. So all these different aspects, it was really the pulling it all together, the communication and the standardization of what we all do and how do we handle that. Coming from a domestic perspective and looking at it at a federal level, that is still the holy grail. There's no one major policy, there's no one major plan that's out there that helps pull all this together. So you've got it from the people who are seeing it first, the public and state, local, tribal, territorial health laboratories, going all the way up to a federal response and to our global partners as well. And this is really hard to kind of push that together. So hoping to take this time to really discuss the public health community at large, kind of summarizing what we've looked at over the past couple of days, what those needs are, and then discussing it from how do we pull this together. And then at the end, we'll turn it over for the next steps and what will be going on after that. So one of the first things that we wanted to talk about is the overall public health need. So thinking and reflecting back on the past couple of days, what are some of the big take-home messages or take-home needs that you see that you've gathered from talking to your colleagues here and that the discussion has broadened over the past couple of days? Yes.
Ryan, NCBI. So the last panel, there's the public health need, which is something along the lines of contact tracing or sort of the epidemiology. But then I think the discussion yesterday about the immunology, the immune response, Betty's comments about like the rapid vaccine development and that's impact on the COVID outbreak. Even if you have good epidemiology, and you can do some sort of public health control measures, that doesn't get you a treatment, a therapeutic. So there is a perhaps somewhat separate parallel need to have some sort of nomenclature that supports the intervention type, the drug development.
Somebody else? Yes.
Justin Ball, University of Georgia. Something that sort of stuck with me throughout this entire meeting is that, and I've probably mentioned this to many people, that subclade classification is largely a service that we are providing to the larger community. But sustainability is a really tough issue. And the comment that public health maybe needs to take a more active role in the permanence of some of these different approaches. Sean's talk today, great example of utility, identifying a new variant early, providing a situational report, and freeing up resources to do that local scale outbreak investigation. Right? If he had to spend all his time and the team spent all the time doing classification, it's consuming a lot of resources. But now the long-term sustainability, I think it really needs active engagement from public health as the consumers if they want that.
Versus communication. So kind of that balance and trade-off in what you're doing, ensuring that the communication is happening early and often, and then the work that's being done for the classification sort of taking away from that. Do I have that?
But also in the long-term sustainability, right? Like if it's driven entirely by academic labs that have, we are people with a long-term vision but very little focus, and something is going to excite us, and a new research opportunity. Maybe there's 2 years ago, very few people were working on AI. I think almost every grant call says we're going to be working on AI. So we have to think about how we're funding our labs, and we are developing new or bringing in new approaches in the labs all the time. And maybe there's a new disease or a new priority in there. So the long-term, the long-term sustainability of these approaches, which we all agree are important, are probably not coming from the academics.
Well, I think that's a really great point. And, in the middle of the pandemic, one of the things that concerned me was a lot of decisions were being made by Twitter and by these informal groups. And I think these issues are too important to rely on volunteer work. I think we need to think really very carefully about, we learned a lot of lessons from this, but part of it, I think, relates to the sustainability of this kind of an infrastructure and more of a formalization of it, because I am concerned that, we have these volunteers, and if they go away, now the system falls apart and things like that. I think that's a big concern.
This is a somewhat different topic, but we saw several times when a lineage or a variant was first detected in a certain location, there was some stigma associated with that. I wonder, and this is a genuine question, I wonder what the role of subspecies classifications and lineage nomenclature is in reducing the amount of stigmatization, or is that just a communications thing?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I think certainly when we saw the emergence of Omicron, the language about Omicron was very stigmatizing, and there were repercussions because of the language that was being used. And it was very rapidly observed that we could detect that particular variant all over the planet, that it was, by the time somebody had reported it, it was already, had already traveled many places. And so I think that rapid deployment of plated-based nomenclature, it would be really, really very critical in terms of addressing that inappropriate geographic ascertainment of particular variants.
Sort of related on the global sort of perspective, there's a number of points made over the course of the workshop related to the impact of sampling density, like house surveillance, sampling bias, etc. And there's also the sense that the world is pretty global now. So even if your mission, your charter is to U.S. health, you can't do U.S. health really well without at least considering the rest of the world. And so if that gets difficult coordinating with international partners that have their own interests, and then Also, funding surveillance at such a large scale costs a lot of money. So how to execute that well in a way that supports nomenclatures, classifications that are actually useful for pandemic preparedness.
Absolutely. I think just from a personal perspective, during COVID, I was still with the Department of Defense, specifically the intelligence team. So you guys know that. And talk about firewalls. Oh, yes. Can you hear me okay? Is it okay? Particularly firewalls. There were very big ones that were put up. So as we were hearing early warning, we were unable to share that because of the nature of the work that we do. And there are global partnerships that are there, but they're not publicly known. And so that is one thing that is a big interest, large scale. And one of the aspects that's coming out with the CDC as well is how do we break down those barriers in the appropriate ways so that people can communicate. And it's not just communicating the information, but also standardization and best practices. So when we have that nomenclature and we are discussing how to best communicate that it's coming out and we have each other's backs, that we're working together for that. And so that's very encouraging news. But I think it's groups like this that we're coming together to sort of codify that, whether it be in policy or standard operating procedures, things like that we have that people could use so they know how that works. Yes.
Alison, yeah, and this relates, and also what Neda was saying about stigmatization also relates to some of the concerns that we've heard during this workshop as well on privacy. So we all live and die by the data that we have available. And so the more data we have, the more comprehensive those data sets are covering the world, covering different diseases, the better able we are to respond, to model, to make predictions. But if we're going to data sets, because of privacy concerns, we have to figure out approaches to alleviate those concerns. But I can't say offhand, I know of the best way to go about that, but it certainly has to be a function of one thing that we address as we begin to develop networks along the lines we've talked about.
Yes.
So what we have seen in some of the data coordination centers, the data is always like 2 to 3 months behind because people are actively analyzing the data. They are very afraid to put that data out. That has to change. Otherwise, your data is always 3 months old. So there should be incentive for surveillance centers submit the data as soon as possible so other people can also analyze the data. Otherwise, we will have this issue of delayed data release.
I'm Anya O'Toole, the University of Edinburgh. On related to the privacy issues, it's something that we have discussed in terms of the granularity of pango lineages and how many cases a single sample may or may not represent. And for, say, SARS-CoV-2, where you have population surveillance and a single sample may actually represent the diversity of a couple of hundred of cases or something like that. That was in contrast to something like MPXV, where you actually have a single case because there's, it's easier to track in terms of transmission. And what we have as one sequence actually does represent a single case of MPXV. So when you're defining lineages, you're actually defining a much smaller cluster of cases. And in terms of ethical considerations for that and identifiability, the granularity of the MPXV lineages is kind of you have to be more careful about what lineages you actually define instead of with SARS-CoV-2, where you know that you're only getting a subset of the cases represented by the sequencing.
Alison, can I make a quick comment to come back to Indresh's comment about submitting to databases or to a data coordinating center? One of the comments I heard is that it's often there's like a big threshold to, we need to facilitate the submission process also, because that is one complaint. And it's a reason people are so busy trying to respond to what is going on, then to devote one person to do the submission is often the issue. So if we can facilitate that'd be part of our SOP.
So BV-BRC has a sequence submission service. We help our users, handhold them to submit the data, and we will happy to help anyone.
Yeah, I also want to comment on that. One of the things we did observe over the course of the pandemic and since then is that people in low resource environments have really wanted to use the tools that we have available. And so they have submitted the data in order to make their particular graphs and their reports and everything. So I think, as I said, incentivizing the development of new tools, especially visualization, like we were talking about yesterday, to make it much more relatable to a wider range of audiences that would be interested in the data is of great importance, I think, for all of us that are here, because that is a motivating factor. That is the carrot, if you want to think of it. Right? NIH has released a policy, which is the stick. Right? You must release your data within a certain amount of time. But I think carrots are always much more effective and bring in people. Other things that we're considering is how to address the privacy with things like privacy record linkages, privacy preserving record linkages, so that you can compute on the data without ever having to actually release the privacy containing data to other third parties, et cetera. So I think we're building on those concepts. We're trying to get there and really enrich the amount and kinds of data that we can compute on without having to give all of that data, but also enable a larger audience of people who want to use this data for their own decisions. And I agree with Elodie that, when we heard from Sean that it took him basically a whole day in order to submit some of the data to fill out a template, an Excel template, which is complicated in itself, right? We are continuing to invest as a community into tools to make that happen. And a big shout out to NCBI for really updating their deposit structure for SARS-CoV-2. I know you're doing it for others. You did it for Mpox. So I think this is just really exciting. And the more we talk about it, the better.
Richard Sharman, National Library of Medicine, to follow up on that, Sean made the point that their LIMS system is not really designed to be able to handle the kind of data that you were generating. And I think besides having the repositories make it easier to accept that data, I think having local LIMS systems that are designed specifically to capture and manage that kind of data in a format that facilitates submission to repositories, I think that could also help overcome that submission bottleneck. And maybe we need to invest in some kind of open access LIMS system for these kinds of public health issues.
Just one of the quick comments that like right now, most of the public health labs, like we're using the LIMS system that originally designed for clinical labs, which are, I wouldn't say totally different world, but like largely different. And there's a saying in our community that every lab have a LIMS and everybody hates it. So yeah, such LIMS system or such tool still is not exist as we speak. So I think that will be a very interesting, perspective to look at.
Philippe Lemercier, Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics. So I just wanted to raise a point that in Switzerland, we have set up a system in which all sequencing centers don't have to submit to GenBank or GZ. We have a unified system called a Swiss Pathogen Platform. So every sequencing center sent every week their sequence to Swiss Pathogen Platform. On this platform, submits to both GenBank and GZ at the same time every week. So it allows Switzerland to provide consistently sequence to public data and GZ data, and also to give a report to the Swiss federal government about variants circulating, so a global report. It worked pretty well in the last couple of years.
I have lots of thoughts, apparently. On the topic of like the data privacy from a slightly different angle, I think I don't know how to go about this, but to a certain extent, there needs to be a cultural change. So perhaps with publishers or something to be more strict about citing where your data comes from. Because there's so much you can do to prevent essentially scooping, and still have rapid open data. And so I think if at a certain point, either it's not going to be rapid and open, or you're going to have scooping, unless there's a real effort to change the culture around how open data is used.
And that kind of along those lines, looking at different systems. So a lot of people have different systems and they don't talk. But having one large system that everybody can use sounds great, but who manages it? And how unwieldy would that become with such a large system? So I posed that question to the group to see if anyone has any major thoughts on that or how that could be broken down to be more user-friendly.
I don't know if it's an answer to the who manages it, but I think we've talked a lot about the different levels of data and who needs to have access to what. And I think that will shift how we communicate, because if everybody's not sure what level they should be communicating at, then we have newspapers running stories about specific variants and then that being confused where the Omicron level might have been appropriate in that case. And so I think being really clear about the hierarchy and then have guidelines for where that would be communicated might allow, like, this is the language that public health should be working in, and understanding, laying it out clearly so that someone can go and see at what level they should be interacting at could potentially add value.
Yeah.
So for your question specifically, so Ryan, I'm at NCBI, but specifically currently I work in SRA. And with the large volume of data, and I mean, I know Aneta with the virus resource tackle similar problems. A big thing, one of the issues people have when there's a centralized repository at such a large scale is finding the data that is relevant to them, which critically relies on metadata that is or is not provided by submitters. So part of that is making the submission process easier. But I'm sure Sean, maybe Andrew could comment better, but sort of in the wild, boots on the ground in the field, there's a chain of custody. So someone who does the original sample collection isn't the person who's doing the epidemiology, the contact tracing, isn't the person doing the sequencing, isn't the person who's submitting to the public repository. And so it's not always that they're not trying or it's too difficult. Some of the relevant information sort of got lost in process. There's also, for doing phylogenetic analyses, besides having the relevant metadata, you need a lot of quality control, which I'm sure Angie could comment on much better. And when you're working with millions upon millions of sequences, that's a really labor-intensive process. And so and in general, if you want to process huge volume of data, it becomes, for almost anything, eventually computationally sort of intractable for most people. And so understanding what sort of intermediary sort of derivative analytical products would be most useful to most people to reach the endpoint they actually want to get at is a thing I spend a lot of time sort of trying to figure out.
So kind of switching gears a little bit, looking at, we've talked about some of the bigger problems that we've thought about, and moving into, system requirements and characterization and standardization. What about workforce development and the workforce itself and understanding these tools? So a lot of times where organizations are recruiting and building capacity for people to understand what all this is and how to use these systems, what if you lose funding and you don't have people anymore? Or are you getting the people that you need as you have funding increases, for example, and you're bringing in people? Are you getting people who are educated in this area and able to use these systems and understand, genomic epidemiology? Yeah.
Hi, Andrew at UVA. One thought that jumps out at me is maybe we don't have a professional society weird enough to represent the sort of discipline or cross-discipline efforts necessary to sustain some of these ideas and conversations. Right now, they're sort of separated, into whatever you might consider ASM and stuff. And I would just add that as part of the CDC effort, Pathogen Genomic Centers of Excellence, done a lot of work at trying to understand needs and gaps and things associated with a lot of what we're talking about here. And the number one thing that came up was one of the top priorities that came up was resources dedicated to maintaining and acquiring personnel that are capable of contributing to the conversation or allocating the necessary trainings to create those personnel. Thanks.
One of the parts. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry about that. Yes, a question in the back. Yeah.
Thank you, Derek Smith from Cambridge. I was going to reply to the same thing, which is that I think it's not just the people who routinely do some of these things, but it's people who, can respond to a pandemic in general, or some form of emergency outbreak in general. In academia, it is the norm, and it is good that PhD students come and go and postdocs come and go. It's one of the things, of course, as we all know, that keeps academia vital. But this is inconsistent with, to respond. And at least in the UK, which is what I know the most, and also what I saw with NIH Save, the academic groups did fantastically in this. And maybe there is no longer term problem to solve, but one of the things that we in Cambridge, and also people I know that at least at Imperial University and another university in the UK are talking about, is to try to see whether or not there can be longer term positions for people who are not sort of on a classic academic path, but who are involved in this more sort of public health centric work. I don't think it's something that can be solved here, but I know that there's more than my group in the UK that are talking about, can we convince our universities to value this at a formal level? Over.
Hi, this is Viria from NIAID. I think I just want to comment to the questions. I think sustainability and maintenance, and we have experienced multiple type outbreaks, urgency, and many presenters, for the last 2 days have mentioned, the usability of open forum, have everything submitted in a public repository, including tools, software, and GitHub. I think Angie, Rachel, and Anya have quite, and when Cornel have been one of the good example of how, whoever interested will, jump in, and then, and I can feel, it is personal opinion. I feel like if everything is being shared broadly, open communication, I feel like this is a really good way to move forward. But at least this is my personal opinion, and I think having public repository and CBI and SDC or anything that you can share as soon as possible, and have tools that automated minimal dependent on the users, because everyone wear multiple hats. As you see, like from, everyone here do more than one thing. So I think if tool can be made more automated, autocorrect when mistype or something, drop down menu, or this is something will be easy, and like Lena mentioned that visualization pictures is more than 1,000 words, right? Like have visualization that can be interpretable by multiple level of users, different background. I think that will, at least to me, I feel like that's moving forward, and start with that and then see how it goes. But thank you. Yeah.
We're sharing the mic over here. So regarding like skill sets and capabilities within different teams, I think one of the things that's very important to consider is that most of us are very capable of picking up new skills. And I think most of us are even very interested in having a diverse range of skills. The problem that people have talked to me about is the time to pick up those new skills. So if whoever is giving you your paycheck doesn't necessarily think that it's important for you to understand how to read a phylogenetic tree, then you're not going to be able to find the time to do that. But I think that goes back to having openly available resources for not just for accessing the data, but that also summarizes the important and relevant parts of the data to make it easier to communicate and easier to pick up when you don't have time to spend 4 hours learning how to use a new tool.
Excellent point. Yes.
So working in outreach on the BV-BRC, I think this whole, we have these tools that people can use, and we have robust documentation and videos, and all of just developing that takes time. But then also there's still people who we need to reach around the world that have differing levels of abilities. So visualization tools are great, but if they don't understand how to even put the data in the first place to get to the visualization tools, then that's a barrier. And I think that really speaks to this long-term engagement that we're talking about. Those questions and concerns will not go away no matter how many help videos that you make. And so unless we have a really big shift in global education on things, which I don't think we will. So I think there's an idealistic view of making sure that if we do it one time, perfect, but I don't think that's the reality that we're experiencing. And it's half my job is this outreach stuff. So it's definitely something that's worth the time and energy, but is, at least in BV-BRC land, grant funded. And if the BV-BRC doesn't exist anymore, then that outreach won't exist anymore. And so something like this, I don't think should just disappear one day. And so I think that goes back to the shift of long-term sustainability of positions like that.
It's just more just a comment, but I remember after the West African Ebola outbreak, there was a real intense interest in trying to get panfilovirus reagents to be protective in case something else came, and then that interest waned pretty quickly. So there was a brief spurt of funding, and then the funding kind of disappeared. And Liliana's beautiful talk really made me optimistic that maybe we've learned a strong lesson with the impact of SARS-CoV-2. But I know this is just this dream that's probably not realizable. But when I saw all of the countries contributing so well to the sequence information that globally, and then I'm seeing those really wane. What strikes me is an international effort to get centers of excellence on different continents that could be used for many diseases, that could keep up the SARS-CoV-2 surveillance as long as we need it, that while they're doing it, you develop the expertise and enable them to look into the other diseases. There's a monkeypox outbreak in Sudan. Okay, do those people have the resources they need to sequence those viruses? Whatever you need, that these people would be there, and it would be worth investing in. I mean, a few sites on every continent, at least, that were centers of excellence with really great local training, an international collaborative community And I think it could be done. I don't know if there's a will to make it be done, but I think it could be done given the beautiful global response in 2022, 2023.
Yeah, just to follow up, this is Elliot, on what Betty's saying. I think what we've been talking about during this workshop about how we can coalesce around common systems where it makes sense for lineage designation, for example. But there are lots of pieces of that we've touched on here. In the end, really, we aren't talking about something that we can implement 30 days from now and it'll be worldwide and it'll solve all the problems. We are talking about, I think, in the end, a distributed worldwide network that's going to be built up in pieces. And so we tackle each one of those pieces, each one of the problems individually to ensure that that's there, that's solving the problem that it's intended to solve, and then connect that to the next piece along the line. So it's sequencing. It's the bioinformatics to assemble the sequences. It's the analytical tools that are present to know how to use that to predict lineages. It's the virus-specific attention that has to come to bear when working with one virus to another virus, and how the lineage prediction impacts that particular virus. And then it's the part that goes to looking at providing reagents so the immunological studies can be done, then so on and so forth. And you know where I'm going, but certainly ending with the public health response. And so I think as we talk about outcomes from the whole workshop, we have to talk about each one of these individual pieces and how you start to arrive at the consensus needed to build that, and then begin to connect the dots and put them together.
This is sort of two parts, one following on Aneta, then Betty, and I guess Elliot as now. But on Aneta's comment about like the supervisors giving people time to learn new skills, one of the things that's been talked about at some of the CDC OAMD meetings is the idea that training is not just needed to bring on new genomic epidemiologists, bioinformaticians. It's needed higher up the management chain so that people higher up understand the importance, the relevance of investing, supporting, and that when they get reports too from people under them on this type of work, they have at least the foundational knowledge to sort of appreciate what's being reported to them. And then sort of following up on Betty, I think the international component, I don't know, maybe it's just a thing I'm very invested in, but the international capacity development, I think everyone likes talking about it. Well, I don't know, not everyone, but I think this group is very invested in that perspective. And I think some of the issues come in, the diseases, the pathogens they're most concerned about are maybe not the things we're most concerned about. But that's what they want the capacity for. And there needs to be, to the extent we want to be helping them, there needs to be that negotiation. There's also just different environment they're working on. I know I went to a talk a couple of years ago developing essentially sort of like lyophilized reagents that don't need to be refrigerated, because in a lot of the settings where you want to be doing the sequencing sampling, they don't have the type of refrigeration capabilities that would be needed to do the protocols that we think work really well here. And so it's not just capacity building, but some of the tooling they don't have the OS they're operating is older than what we're doing. They don't have infinite RAM for the compute. So I think there's some reagent tooling type development that would need to take into consideration their particular needs.
I want to pull on something you just said, which I think is really important from the international perspective, which is that we may have differing focus areas at the time. And, because there's not every single day a pandemic that's going to bring everyone together collectively, but it's having all of those things in place so that those networks and those communications happen. And I think just practicing that, even if it is in areas that a group is not focused in, is very important. The other part of that is codifying it into policy. I think that's really, really important, where you put that in. So when funding is pulled or when funding is increased or decreased, you can say this is feeding into this particular policy. We're required to do this. I think that really helps to help codify the work that's being done. And all of this leads to where some of the problem areas that I think we can all relate to, which is that many of these networks are house of cards. It's based on personal relationships and friendships, which is wonderful. It's passionate people coming together to talk and to do great work and to work within public health. But if somebody retires or somebody leaves or chooses another job, that can be devastating for one of those pathways. So I think whatever this group, and as we move forward and we build those pieces, like Elliot was saying, one of the things that we need to do is codify that in ways that it's sustained and resilient, because it is sometimes built on a house of cards. So with that, say, kind of bringing everything together, so that we allow enough time to have a wrap up with everything from the past couple of days, is just with this overall public health, preparing for the next pandemic. One of the things is practicing it. You know, when we talk about a lot of things or putting things in place, we also practice it as well. So I just wanted to open up the conversation to what do you think would be some of those actionable small steps that could be taken now that would help move us towards a larger codified response, and how would we practice seeing that those actually work? Does anyone have any suggestions? Yes.
Andrew Beck, CDC. So, and this may cause some groans, and I'm prepared for this, but so, well, I haven't said anything yet. One element of sustainability is this issue. It's sustainability is the same as reproducibility, but kind of not, right? There's overlap with that in some ways. And, one of the, I think we've all been in a pandemic, and et cetera. These are issues that we're all very familiar with. But another way to say reproducibility is that you trust your result over time, right? That there's a system in place, or there's a philosophy in place, or there's a structure in place that can be brought to bear to answer a question, and you trust that when that system is brought to bear, that the answer is reliable, or it's useful for the public in some way or another. And I mean, there are some viruses where a base or two difference can make a policy difference. It can affect the flow of money. It can affect where people travel, and it can affect where resources are disposed. So here's where the groans are going to come. So I'm prepare for this. At my institution, we find ourselves increasingly having to consult with folks that are really knowledgeable about regulatory affairs. And this is not really much of an issue for my academic colleagues here, but we talk about sustainability over time. Well, sure, there's staff turnover. That happens all the time. And sometimes the most knowledgeable person in your group has to leave, or they get a promotion, something like that, and all the knowledge goes away. Well, kind of, right? So one of the ways that we protect ourselves against that is that we consult with our regulatory affairs professionals, with our quality control people, et cetera, and we get their opinion on what's necessary to make a system sustainable and make the answer accurate over time, right? So I know that not all institutions represented here may have to or really want to engage with folks who have those types of competencies, but I think in some cases, if you need a view into what it's really going to take to make a sustainable answer in a sustainable system, sometimes the quality control person is the place to go first, and maybe that bears on places where we consult.
So we do only have 1 minute left. So I want to make sure that I give enough time to everybody here. So we'll take one more question and then have a wrap up for the past days. So yes.
So I'm just summarizing multiple questions or the comments online. All are related to capacity building. Some around the world, people don't have the reagents on shelf, don't have the instrument. They cannot do the active surveillance unless there is a sustained funding for the capacity building. Otherwise, they don't have the capacity, even though they have the samples. So that is important from their perspective.
I want to comment on that, or maybe Sean was going to comment on that, because I would say that's not applicable only to people outside of the United States, but domestically as well. We have a real concern with that. Sean, I think, alluded to it in his talk.
Yeah, and I just also wants to sort of like answer or provide an idea for how we can prepare for the next one, big or small. One things that we did at the Department of Health is to do a tabletop study or tabletop exercise. It's a very economic way to bring together like epidemiologists, invention preventionists, clinicians, public health labs, to form the EOC style and just do a on table drill. But the exercise that we did is only limited to pretend a local novel influenza outbreak due to like human animal contact in that Northwood areas, and do that, but not necessarily limited to this particular scenario if we want to do something more on a broader scale. So
over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for a great closeout session. Now we're just going to spend a brief time talking about next steps, because this was just the first step, and there are many more to come. I do, though, so it won't get short shrift, want to thank a number of people. First of all of the speakers who spoke during the workshop, and everybody here on site and everybody online who participated, asking questions, answering questions. I think it's because of you that this was such a great success. I do want to thank our organizers, our NIAID sponsors, Liliana and Wiria, NCBI organizers, Aneda and Rodney Brister, all of the CDC people who contributed, Allison, Paul Rhoda, Duncan McCannell, Ellie Click, Jason Karavis, and then the BV-BRC team. They're people you haven't seen, in addition to Indresh Singh and Anna Capria, who've been here. Roshni, April, and Mehmet all contributed to helping put this together. I want to thank Richard Sharman for being part of the idea that helped to initiate all of this. And then especially, as much as anybody else, all of you have been in contact with Lucy Stewart, and without Lucy's hard effort to help put this all together, it would not have happened. So I want to thank all of you for this.